Please unmute.
Okay, sorry.
This is with the live stream.
The live stream.
Here, it says that it's on, so I'm not sure why.
Like we can't. It's like a kid.
Okay.
I can hear you
Thank
now.
you. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Can you restate your conflict there? I don't know if I look or, you know.
Yeah, I used to work with John, but I don't think it's a conflict, but I just wanted to be aware of what years back, excellent person.
And mine is that I'm getting the project. Right, any public comments? You have 3 minutes. Okay, no public comment. That's closed at 9:03. Board member comments?
I have one.
Could you make sure your microphone right in front of you?
I think from what I'm hearing, you picking it up? Okay. In the latest package it's sent out, I read something which I want to share, and I will apologize to everyone for not knowing it before, but sorry, my electronics are fighting me here. Under section 109, Michigan Mechanical Code, which is similarly referenced in the building code. Section 109 deals with means of appeal. And it talks about interested parties being able to appeal findings of the building department. It also has something called limitation of authority. The Board of Appeals shall not have authority relative to interpretation of the administration's, or such board be empowered to waive requirements of this code. I think that's really important fact we've got to get out there. Further, there is, sorry. When conflicts occur between provisions of this code and the reference standard, provisions of this code shall apply. My interpretation of that, my reading of that, tells me that if Michigan Mechanical Code, Michigan Building Code says something, and a reference code says something different, the Michigan Building Code wins out. And I understand that the Michigan Building Code is a code, international building code that the state of Michigan adopted with reference and changes. The International Fire Code and others are adopted by reference. That statement that if reference codes differ, you can follow. I think we had discussion as if the reference codes, because of what they said, outweighed the Michigan code. Michigan code is saying no, they're number one. I think this whole debate that we've had probably has been for naught. I wish I'd known this before, sorry. Just wanted that on the record.
Any other comments from the board?
So the understanding is we do not have the authority to interpret. We do not have the authority to waive any rules.
I read that this morning, that in my review, that I also caught that one today, but that's as much as I know. So I guess to the county to give some input on that.
Honestly, I think you keep that in mind is, I think we can hear what's presented and then the board will ultimately be asked to make a decision.
No more any other comments?
But I want to hear what the applicant wants to say.
Okay. So we move on to the first action item, reconvene the July 25th, 2023 Construction Board of Appeals meeting requested by Christopher Frederickson of Traverse City Whiskey Company regarding ventilation requirements for new whiskey barrel storage building under construction at 9440 South Center Highway, Traverse City. First item is invitation for the applicant to present his request.
Good morning, Ethan Holtz again on behalf of the applicant. I want to thank the board once again for all agreeing to meet so quickly after our last session and put in the time. Let me respond, Mr. Miller, to the statement you just made about the authority of this board and what it can do. While you did accurately read those code provisions, section 113.1 of the Michigan Building Code provides that a construction board of appeals, an application to a construction board of appeals, can and shall be based on a claim that the true intent of the code or the rules governing construction have been incorrectly interpreted, the provisions of the code do not apply, or an equal or better form of construction is proposed. Section 113.2 provides that the board has the ability to decide whether the true intent of the code or the rules legally adopted thereunder have been incorrectly interpreted, the provisions of the code do not fully apply, or an equally good or better form of construction is proposed. The application before you presents all three of those situations. And as you'll recall, we do have a dispute that the provisions of the code are not being correctly applied here and or do not apply. And I want to start with that and move through it fairly quickly because there's been a lot of discussion about it. And I prepared for the board kind of a quick chart. If you remember last time I was here, I said that marching through these code provisions is sort of playing a mental game of connect the dots. So I've prepared a chart that will go dot to dot to dot for the board so we can walk through that first half of the argument. And this is all stuff that's been in the packets that everyone has submitted you from both sides, frankly. But I kind of just put it together in what I hope is an easy to follow way to crystallize it for everybody.
My first question is, does the board have this packet? The construction department?
Yes and no. There is nothing in, I did this over the weekend. This is just code sections. There is nothing in here that was not in our original submission. And actually half of it was in the county submission also.
That
So-
doesn't answer my question.
No.
They have this packet.
No,
I don't understand why we're discussing it if they don't have this review.
it's just kind of a visual aid.
You have a copy, please share with them.
Absolutely. So, and what I start with is the applicant's position, and then I move on to the county's position. Okay, where the applicant starts, the first code section you have to look at is 102.1, which is matching from both the Michigan Building Code and the Michigan Mechanical Code. And it says that where there is a conflict between a general requirement and a specific requirement, the specific requirement shall be applicable. Okay, let's focus on the first part of that. If there's a general and a specific, the specific wins over the general. The second part, and that is central to the applicant's argument. Now, central to the county's argument.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Because you're right, what it said here, what you represented here is correct. But in the Michigan Mechanical, it further goes in 102.8 conflicts. Where conflicts occur between provisions of this code and the referenced standards, provisions of this code shall apply, which negates the reference standard if it's in dispute with the basic Michigan code.
And
It doesn't talk about whether more stringent or anything else. It talks about Michigan building code.
yes, and there is no conflict with the building code here. As we march through, you're going to see it is not a conflict. It is actually the building code requires you to consult the fire code, which it incorporates. That's not a conflict. It makes it a part of one.
Incorporates by right.
That's correct. So, well, you're getting to the end of my argument,
Okay.
but what happens is the building code actually sends you to the fire code. That is not a conflict. That is a direction. So going back to where I was, the second part of 102.1, and this is partially what the county relies on, is where in any specific case, different sections of this code specify different materials, methods of or construction or other requirements, the most restrictive shall govern. Okay, we do not have that situation here. There aren't different, that specifically talks about where you have different sections talking about a specific material or method of construction that say there are two different ways to do it. That's not the situation we have here. The conflict here, the county is asking for the imposition of a general standard over a specific. Not that there are two different ways of doing it. This is general versus specific. And when you have general versus specific, that first sentence applies. So the next section we look at is Michigan Mechanical Code, which gives you the ventilation requirement for warehouses. That speaks for itself. Then you look at Michigan Mechanical Code 502.9, which gives you the requirements, specific requirements for hazardous materials. And it says hazardous materials shall be provided as required in 502.8 and sections 502.9.1 through 502.9.11. Those are where you find the specific requirements for hazardous materials. So you look at 5.2.9, 5.2.9.5 next, because that is flammable and combustible liquids. And that is what we're dealing with here. And these are the specific requirements for flammable and combustible liquids. And it says exhaust ventilation systems shall be provided as required by sections through 502.9.5.5 for the storage, use, dispensing, mixing, and handling of flammable and combustible liquids. Unless otherwise specified in this section, shall apply to any quantity of flammable and combustible liquids. Okay, so this is what is going to apply to flammable and combustible liquids. Right after that, in that section, it says there is an exception. This section shall not apply to flammable and combustible liquids that are exempt from the International Fire Code. So it fast forwards you to the International Fire Code. It's not a conflict between the two. It is actually saying you must go and use the fire code. And what it is saying is if a flammable and combustible liquid, even though flammable and combustible is exempt from the International Fire Code, then this section does not apply. The requirements under this section do not apply. Okay, so then you go to the fire code. IFC 501, exception 10. And it says, this chapter shall apply to all hazardous materials, except, and you go down to exception 10, the storage of beer, distilled spirits, wines, and barrels and casks. That's what we have here, distilled spirits in barrels. And what the fire code says is that is exempt. So looking back at 502.9.5 of flammable combustible liquids under the building or mechanical code, the fire code exception becomes part of the mechanical code also. That's why it's exempt. And that's why we say, now you apply the general standard for warehouses, 0.6 CFM for square foot of airflow. Okay. The next section here is what the county is saying. Okay. The county goes to 502.9.5.2. Storage rooms and warehouses. Liquid storage rooms and liquid storage warehouse for quantities of liquids exceeding those specified in the International Fire Code shall be ventilated in accordance with section 502.8.1. Two issues with that. Number one, that incorporates the fire code just like our argument did, but it misses the fact that these barrels are exempt under the fire code. 502.9.5 expressly provides that 502.9.5.2, which the county is relying on, does not apply to flammable and combustible liquids that are exempt from the International Fire Code. It says that. So since they are exempt from the fire code, they are exempt from this room and warehouse storage requirement. Now, that's just part one. Part two of what the county says is that in the commentary, the IFC commentary to the exception we rely upon, which is 5000.1 exception 10, the commentary says that doesn't change just because you're using a whiskey barrel, you're storing a whiskey barrel, that doesn't change the occupancy of the structure. It remains a group H occupancy under the Michigan Building Code. We agree with that. It does remain a group H occupancy. So what you have to do next is then look at what the requirements for ventilation of a group H occupancy are under the building code. So under Michigan Building Code 202, this is what we figure out what we've got under the building code. What we have here in these barrels is what the building code defines as a flammable liquid of class IC, because it's a liquid having a flash point at or above 73 degrees Fahrenheit and below 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The category and what the definition says is this category of flammable liquids does not include compressed gases or cryogenic fluids. Okay, so that classifies what the whiskey in the barrels is. It is a flammable liquid class IC. So next, you have to look at what the ventilation requirements for that and what group it falls into. The Michigan Building Code 307.5 defines what high hazard group H3 are, and that's what this whiskey in barrels falls into. It's class 1, 2, or 3 flammable or combustible liquids that are stored in normally closed containers at pressures under 15 psi. Okay, that's what these bourbon barrels are. They're flammable and combustible liquids stored in closed containers with less than 15 psi. Okay, so next, Michigan Building Code 415.10 provides the ventilation requirements for groups H3 and H4, which is what these barrels are. Groups H3 and H4 shall be constructed in accordance with the applicable provisions of this code and the International Fire Code. So it again sends you back to the fire code, makes it a part of it. The fire code is in the building code. So you again have to look back at the IFC for the requirements for whiskey barrels. Then you again go to the exception 10. So there's no conflict there between the building code and the fire code. The building code says for an H3 occupancy, flammable combustible liquid, you have to look at the fire code. And the fire code again exempts these barrels. So since it is exempted, that is the specific requirement. The specific requirement actually is that there is no specific requirement. You then go back to the general, which is provided by the Michigan Mechanical Code for warehouses, 0.06 CFM square foot of airflow for warehouses. And that's why the applicable code standard is the 0.06. So that's why we submit the code has not been correctly interpreted, because the building code works with the fire code. And if you examine the group H occupancy requirements under the building code, it shoots you back to the fire code, which brings in this exception and renders you back then again to the building code for the general standard for warehouses, which is why this is confusing and circular, and it took me weeks to figure it out myself. But I think I've got it now, and I hope I've been able to explain it. And the one last thing I'll say is the 1 CFM per square foot general standard that the county is advocating, it's true that that is a general standard, just like the 0.06. The difference between the two is there is a specific exemption from the 1 CFM per square foot. 502.9.5.2 expressly states that that does not apply to liquids and combustible, flammable and combustible liquids that are exempt from the fire code. That's what the mechanical code says. You don't apply this to an exempt liquid, flammable and combustible liquid from the fire code. You don't do it. And that is a specifically negating a general. And that's why you use the general standard for warehouses instead of the general standard that the county is advocating. That's why one general beats the general, because a specific steps in and negates one, not the other. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
My understanding, the purpose of this meeting was that the applicant was to show specifically, in reality, of putting barrels in and having it tested for that level of air requirement or meeting the requirement. It was not this. It was specifically to show it in actuality.
And we're prepared to do that, but my recollection and my understanding, if you'll recall, is that at our last meeting, and the application that's submitted has 2 proposals in it. One is that the building code has been incorrectly applied or interpreted. And we requested a ruling and a vote on that aspect at the last meeting, which was not held. And second was in the alternative. In the event the board determines that the proper standard has been applied and that the code is correctly interpreted, that as an alternative, the applicant has requested a variance and or interpretation that an equal or better form of construction applies here, which is the phased entry plan. And I'm prepared to address that. And I imagine we're going to get there and talk about that in great detail. And the board and the county have received our submissions on both of those. And we brought our environmental consultant who's here to address all that as well. But I kind of wanted to get this out of the way first, since we never had a vote or a ruling on that issue. For purposes of the record, I think we need to do that. And I'd be happy to be quiet and let the county respond and or take a vote on that issue before we even move on to the other, and just get it over with and get out of the way.
Yes, I would like to have the county respond. I'd also like you to fulfill the request that this board had, and the reason that we're meeting today was for them to show specifically an actuality situation.
Yes, and we'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Invitation to the Building Safety Department to present ruling. Since there are two different issues, David mentioned that we'll do the same process twice.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's cleanest, like Ethan's pointed out, is to address this first part of the appeal, because they are interconnected. You
Right.
can't really separate them. So if we get an answer from you guys on this first part, then we can go into the second part.
Okay, just wanted to.
Yep.
Say it out loud.
Can you clarify from the last meeting, April, what the language was specifically that the board is being asked? I don't think we have that in the current packet.
I don't,
Sorry.
Pardon the interruption. There's some folks that are in the waiting room for the live stream. Is somebody able to grant them access?
so there's two issues before the board. The first one is what we're talking about now, is the interpretation of the code from our standpoint versus the TC Whiskey team as it relates to ventilation. The second part of the appeal is their proposed plan under the code for alternative. I don't have that specific here, but they're appealing that they have an alternative means to meet the code. So two parts. First is related to this issue, and the second part will be related to their proposed plan. In both cases, the building department has already made a decision. That's why they're here appealing those issues today. Tucker, do you want to touch on this here?
After listening to the statements you guys made and the statements that TC Whiskey has made, I think it's pretty clear where we both stand. And the underlying issue is whether they are, that note 10 exemption exempts them out of what we're requiring or not. I know we spent a lot of time up front about rates. That's never been something that we really got into with Traverse City Whiskey, because they're just stating that they're exempt. We're stating they're not. That's why we need the first vote. We have problems with the way we see the alternative design, but we have never gotten there because they just say they're exempt.
And the debate is whether it's 1 or 306.
The debate is whether they're required or not. The no exemption in the International Fire Code, from what they're stating, is they're exempt from ventilation at any rate above a standard warehouse with nothing being stored in it. So I think we can't really get into why we disagree with an alternative design as presented till we know whether or not we have interpreted it correctly. Does that make sense?
So between, like, will you please explain to us, like, the conversations that you've had with the applicant? Maybe even prior to this appeal about this pretty distinct, in my opinion, general versus specific, getting into the technical language. To me, it seems that is that where the roads go in different directions?
Right at the very beginning. Yep.
Yeah. And how, I guess, that first one, the very first one on the sheet they just gave us, that's where that split happens, and, and I'm wondering, how that could be, like, why is the general taking precedent, or, that pathway being taken versus the specific, like the requirements, and it's just that's something that I think that is.
I guess the way that I'm kind of looking at it is that 502.8 is a general. 502.9 is the specific. So there's no disagreement there. They're saying the specific is taking precedence over the general. The problem I have with this is that the specific sends you back to the general. And then the general, it's first heading is storage in excess of the maximum allowable quantities. In the such huge difference in quantities, the fire code saying you can do, if you take the barrel exception out of it, we're talking 240 gallons versus, I don't remember the exact, it's thousands of gallons. So the sheer quantity of the flammable liquid, I get lost in the equations they present. So we kind of tried sending that off. We didn't get a definitive answer on that before this meeting. So the equations that they're trying to use
Let's stick
are
just to
over our
this.
heads. So
The equations are part of the second part. Let's stick just to,
it all, yes. It all comes back to whether they're exempt or not. And
we're
it
reading the
keeps
same
sending you in
thing, but
circles.
we're interpreting it differently is the issue.
Right, and I mean, so what is, they gave the reason why they feel they're exempt. Why does the county feel they're not exempt?
I think you guys stated that pretty well when we sent our appeals packet out. I feel like it says the general and the reference standard and the code conflict. We feel that's a conflict. Where the extent of the reference to a reference standard or a standard includes subject matter that is within the scope of this code, the provisions of the code are applicable and shall take precedence over the provisions of the reference code or standard.
And where's that? I'm sorry.
That's in 102.8. Specifically, he's reading 102.8.2, page 12 in the packet.
Mine's, reading this and having spent many years of writing technical stuff, it leaves so much up for interpretation is where, it gives like the first part of that 102.8.2. It's, being very clear on what it wants, and then it says as applicable. Like what that opens it up for interpretation.
That's why you guys got to interpret it.
So
That's
Which way you
the-
want to go.
that's, so it tries to give a hard line, and then it says, oh, if you think it does, and that's difficult. Can't skip those two words. I mean, in my brain.
Where does it say it? That's it.
Almost right before it, right there. So that,
As Ethan said, this is a very difficult, convoluted matter. You're constantly going in circles. You're going from one book to the next and coming back. Each side has interpreted it, and we both feel strongly about our interpretation. So now we're asking you guys as a third party to weigh in on each of those interpretations. Has the county misinterpreted? Have they misinterpreted? Is there somewhere, in the middle here? Which one is correct here? You can see why both parties have been going round and round with this.
right.
It's not lack of effort on either side here.
We went around last time, and I thought a solution was for the applicant to show in reality the amount required not to have a problem of physically constructing an example.
They're gonna touch on that once you rather arrive at a decision here as far as this current issue. The issue is that code does not allow us to experiment,
Oh,
cannot waive requirements or create new code. That's not within the realm of our authority, nor you as the board's authority. We have to find something that meets the intent. So that's part of the next phase. But first, again, these issues are connected. We need you to weigh in
The
on
first
this.
decision is whose pathway do we think is correct?
Yeah, which interpretation, has the building department misinterpreted this issue? And it should be as Ethan's team has presented here, or vice versa. That's what this issue is.
And it is, this is the confusing thing when you write in-spec booklets, it's not, everybody will look at things a little differently. And, I feel that both parties have a good argument, personally. I personally think that the interpretation by the applicant would has legal bearing, or, I'm not a lawyer, but, I feel that they have a good case. That a judge may or may not go in their favor. If this was ever to go to that level, I don't know how it would, but as provided here on this worksheet, assuming that everything is, the wording is copied verbatim out of what it actually is. So I don't have the booklet and the actual codes in front of me to make sure, but I would assume that they're submitting something that is as written in the code books. And if if there is an exemption option there, I mean, that's a big difference. It's either the project can go or not as built. And I think that personally, at a certain point, for me, you have to trust that the best intentions are there. And know that this is not being built to be a dangerous and explosive building. I mean, that's, I mean, like that, I wouldn't think that the designers and our owners are gonna build something that could kill themselves, their employees, or their product, business, so. But I know that that's. Well, we're moving.
Just ask if there's any.
Oh, so I guess. Thanks, Deb. We're moving into the question and answer about this, unless you guys have, the board, does the county have any more? Question and answer, and that, I get, is that to both parties, Deb? Or to the board?
I intended that for both parties. So if you guys had questions after hearing from one side or the other afterwards, you guys could have another chance to chat with both of us.
Okay. Does the board have any questions and answer for either party at this point? Okay, I guess we go to board discussion for the first vote item, which is if the pathway of interpretation of the codes from the applicant or the county is, which one feels stronger, or I don't know what the right term would
I
be.
don't know if we have the language that was in the minutes. I didn't see the actual language.
It seems like a yes, no. I guess that's a question for Amber.
Maybe Ethan could speak to that a little bit
I guess the in the application and the way it would be phrased is which code standard is the proper standard for ventilation to be applied to this facility as required by the code, either the 0.06 CFM per square foot or the 1 CFM per square foot is the proper code application.
But I don't want to make it about rate because there is specific language in there for alternative designs. And we're not stuck at 1 CFM per square foot. Your argument's right, it wrecks your product, but we've never been able to come together and what an alternate design could be.
Well, so I guess that's part two.
That's part two, but
Yeah.
but the way you're phrasing it, it's either this or this is not the position we're taking.
Okay, so I guess then the way to phrase it is the applicant's interpretation correct? That 0.06 per square foot is the applicable standard under the code. And it would be a yes or no on that.
We could do that.
Can you restate that? Because I think it is critical before the board makes any kind of, takes any action on a dispute, is to understand really what's in dispute.
All right,
And we've walked around it so many times, quite honestly, I now find myself questioning my understanding of it.
all right. So the question as submitted to the board by the applicant is whether or not pursuant to the code, the Michigan Building Code, the requirements of the Michigan Building Code, whether the applicable standard for ventilation applied to this facility is 0.06 CFM per square foot. And the applicant submits that that is the required rate of ventilation for this facility under the building code for the reasons we've stated. That that's how the code works. When you walk through the applicable code sections, including the specific versus general requirement, the requirements for airflow for warehouses, the Michigan Mechanical Code for flammable and combustible liquids, and the International Fire Code as incorporated by those. And then the standards for group H occupancy, which also again incorporate the Michigan Building Mechanical Code and International Fire Code, you arrive at the 0.06 CFM per square foot of ventilation.
Amber, would you agree with,
So to paraphrase, what he's saying is they.
no, I was saying, would you agree with what he just said?
Yes, yes, he's saying that he's asking you guys to say yes or no as to their code path and interpretation that the rate should be 0.06. So it's a yes, no on that.
And so the board discussion, is there any other questions that the board has?
Yeah, I thought we came back here to
Just talking to
decide,
Mike.
I thought we were going to decide on an alternate, which meant they agreed with the numbers before. And now we're starting over.
There's still two questions that have to be addressed. And the first one is the Board of Appeals opinion on the ventilation rate. And that's what's been presented. So once we get that issue resolved, then item 2 would be discussion.
Yeah, item 2 would be, we first have to talk about the rate, and then we have to then talk about building.
I thought we decided that before. That's why they were gonna come back with an alternate.
No, there's, again, as Ethan said too, there's 2 issues on the table for you guys to decide on. One being this rate, the second being their alternative plan proposed. They're gonna speak on their alternative plan, but we're asking you guys to make a decision first on the rate
Yeah,
interpretation.
and after we vote on that, then we go back up to the action item A and start over with the building.
Correct. Then they'll present their case on that
I
item.
misunderstood before.
Nope.
Already decided that.
Not yet.
My personal opinion is they presented a pathway that exists to get to the 0.06 CFM. I think that overall, this cast, the reasons my decision is being made there is I think that it talks about very specifically about, where is it at? In IFC 5001.1, exception 10, they find that pathway, and it clearly says storage of beer, distilled spirits, and wines in barrels and casks. If that is a true pathway to get to that exception, which it seems to be, I feel they have a strong argument of why they have built their building how they have, but also why they're pointing to this. Is there any more discussion?
Yeah, one thing, I understand point about the reference code and thing. But then we read provision 102.8.2, provisions and reference codes and standards. And the extent of the reference to a reference code or standard includes the subject matter that is within the scope of this code. Provisions of this code, as applicable, shall take precedence over provisions of the reference code or standard. I will be the first one to admit, to read that, and it has gone around the circle, and Lord knows where it really stops. But it seems to be the code saying, we haven't told you to look at this, but it doesn't really apply if we don't say the same thing.
Right, and I would say that makes sense if there was a conflict between the two. But here there's no conflict because the building code says it's not or you can look at, or you could look at the fire code. It says you go to the fire code. So there's no conflict there. It actually makes the fire code part of the building code.
Where the extent of the reference to a reference code or standard includes subject matter that is within the scope of this code, provisions of this code as applicable shall take precedence over the provisions of the reference code standard. it doesn't. No logical content in the building code, quite honestly.
Totally. But here's why it's not
Interpretation of it.
well, here's why it's not in conflict with the building code. Sorry, here's why it's not in conflict with the building code, is because this code, the building code, actually the Michigan Mechanical Code, in talking about storage rooms and warehouses, says, okay, in 502.9.5, that 502.9.5.2 does not apply to flammable and combustible liquids that are exempt from the IFC. Okay, there's nothing in the building code that says anything different than what the mechanical code says. It's not like the building code provides some other alternative, because we went over that. The building code's other alternative is found in the occupancy classifications, which is the group H. And we marched through the requirements of the group H, and the group H sends you back to the mechanical code, which sends you back to the fire code. So there's nothing other in the building code that you need to look at. But in the mechanical code, when they're talking about storage rooms and warehouses, 502.9.5.2 says that this general standard doesn't apply. It doesn't apply if you're exempt from the IFC. So it's not there's some other provision of this building code that should win over the reference section. It's the building code says you go to the reference section. That's where you must go to look at this. And what you see when you get there, where you arrive, is an exception for barrels.
And so really, it seems like the question here is if exception 10 applies or not.
To this facility, yeah, but that's ultimately where you arrive. It's a long, twisted, circular journey through the building code, the mechanical code, and the fire code. But it is linear. You get there, you go section to section to section, and there isn't any conflict between them because of that specific exemption in the mechanical code for flammable liquids that are exempt under the fire code. Without that language, I would totally agree. But that specific language says this is what takes you out of it. And that makes it a specific over a general, because there is that language.
There's
And
also the language about limitation of authority, this board. And that's probably a bigger issue for me. The Board of Appeals shall not have authority relative to interpretation of the administration of this code, nor shall such board be empowered to waive requirements of this code. The first part, not the.
okay, but we're not asking you to interpret it. And what I read you before, this function is exactly what this board is empowered to do.
We don't
Which
have
is-
the authority relative to interpretation of the administration of this code.
It is to decide, well, 1.13.2, limitations on authority, says an application for appeal shall be based on a claim that the true intent of the code or the rules legally adopted thereunder have been incorrectly interpreted. The provisions of the code do not fully apply, or an equally or good or better form of construction is proposed. We're not asking you to waive any requirements of the code. The interpretation made by the building department is that we are saying the wrong standard for ventilation applies. So we are saying that interpretation, for the reasons I've given you, is incorrect. And that's what the board is here to decide.
Totally understand what you're saying, and I think we've just uncovered or brought up another conflict within the language of the code, because it says the Board of Appeals shall not have authority relative to the interpretation, the administration of this code.
Well, that's correct. And that means in the first instance, you don't administer the code. That's what the county has done already. They're the ones interpreting and administering the code when they told us that this was not the standard for ventilation that applies. We are asking you to decide if it's been administered or interpreted correctly.
The Board of Appeals shall not have authority relative to the interpretation of the administration of this code. I read that and adding some language to it, but I don't have the right or the authority relative to interpret what they reinterpret the way their administration. It's a conundrum.
I think you do, or else there would be no appeals process. You know, and I think the county would agree with me on this.
Yes.
And that's how it works. And, you know, it travels all the way up the line like this. Say you disagree with my applicant's interpretation, and you all vote no right now. I then have the right to appeal that to the State Construction Board of Appeals. And then after that, I think you go to the courthouse after the State Construction Board of Appeals, but you need to vote yes or no first.
The problem and where you guys are getting lost is too, the mechanical code has just this one section and Ethan's giving you the section out of building, which gives you a little more information. Okay, the language isn't entirely the same.
Understand that. We're dealing with a mechanical question.
Correct.
Mechanical code says we can't do much.
The mechanical code is incorporated into the building code, and the building code overall is what gives you your authority. The Construction Board of Appeals is actually established by the building code.
I also understand that elsewhere in the code, it says more restrictive shall apply. This is the more restrictive in terms of this board's ability.
Well, and
I just,
no, and that's a different section. We covered that one. And the more restrictive will apply is found in both the building code and the mechanical code in 102.1. And it says where in any specific case, different sections of this code specify different materials. We don't have a case here where different materials are being specified. Different methods of construction. We don't have a case where different methods of construction are specified, or other requirements. The most restrictive shall govern. Okay, this isn't a question of there are two conflicts. We're saying there is a specific requirement here, and that's that first sentence of 102.1, and that applies over the general. Where there is a conflict between a general requirement and a specific requirement, the specific requirement shall be applicable. And that's what we're saying exists here. There is a conflict between the general requirement, which is 1 CFM square foot, and what we say is a specific requirement, which is that whiskey barrels under the fire code are exempt from the 1 CFM for square foot. That is the specific requirement. And so the specific requirement, that exemption applies over the general, and thus you go back to the building code's general requirement for warehouses, which is 0.06.
Is there any other discussion, questions?
Yes, I'll speak to it because I have a responsibility to. One of the things is, I think makes this appeal more significant is the scale of this structure. You know, this is 20,000 square feet or 600,000 cubic foot of building with 50,000 gallons of whiskey in it. It's not a small question. It's not a small challenge. Um, I have a hard time going against the county's review.
Right, we need to vote that if the county's interpretation of the code, which is requesting 1.0 CFM cubic square foot of airflow, is correct.
Are you making that motion? It's the,
Looking for a motion.
it's the question, so that.
Yeah, the question,
I don't know if he's making the motion, he's just stating the question.
yes,
Somebody would have to make a motion.
I'll make a motion then, I guess, my intent as a board, can I?
You can,
Okay.
you did mention that you were going to abstain, so I'm just letting you know that that is a formal
Okay,
action, so
Got
it's
it.
your choice.
thank you. No, I will, I'll leave it at the question. Is there a motion? Is there somebody that would like to make that motion? Oh,
We have to make a motion.
yes, you do. But I cannot do it because I'm recusing myself.
I make the motion that the building department's review of this project stands.
We need a support for that to go forward.
Second motion just to get it on the table.
There's been a motion and support, and
All those in support?
sorry, you have to say, I'm speaking to the microphone, whether you approve or not for this vote.
Aye.
Three votes.
Three votes
So
in
motion-
support of the motion.
So the motion would pass.
Okay. So now that we have that out of the way, and I take it that the interpretation is that the board has voted in support of the county's position.
That's correct.
Okay, great. So now we can move on to what we were going to discuss. I'm going to ask Chris and everybody else to join me up here, which is the alternative proposal of a better form of construction. Or as was pointed out, what perhaps how we might be able to determine what the applicable rate should be. And what we spent the bulk of our time last time discussing, we thank the board for all the effort that was put in last time. The board gave us a bunch of issues to investigate. We've done that. We've submitted a new proposal, which was in the packets everybody has. Before we get there and just talking about this proposal, I wanted to bring up one thing that I noticed between the last time we were here and now, and I was reviewing the county's submission at the very first CBA hearing. And I recall, Mr. Miller, you had some questions about what the discus suggests and requires. I think you asked Chris about that. And the county had submitted this, and I have copies for everybody, and everybody has this already too. This was just from the county's submission. At the original hearing. It's one of the county's exhibits. Discus, which is an alcohol industry organization. Thank you. And if you'll notice, the county in their submission highlighted section 5.7.3. That, as Mr. Miller pointed out, said an acceptable alternative is to provide ventilation at a rate of not less than 1 CFM per square foot of solid floor area. But if you look at 5.7.1, which is back up 2 sections, it says enclosed areas handling or using alcohol should be ventilated at a rate sufficient to maintain the concentration of vapors within the area at or below 25% of the LFL. This should be confirmed by sampling of the actual vapor concentration under normal operating conditions. So, and that is before you get to 5.7.3, which provides, quote, an acceptable alternative to doing what they say in 5.7.1. And what they're talking about doing in 5.7.1 is exactly what Traverse City Whiskey Company is proposing to do here. Set up a test, sample, and make sure it's safe. The 1 CFM per square foot is the fallback position. That's what you can use as an alternative if you don't want to go through the time, effort, and expense of doing what this applicant is proposing to do. And so we have a phased startup plan to do what Discus says you should be doing in these situations. Put barrels in, sample them under normal, sample the vapor under normal operating conditions, and make sure it's at or below 25% of the lower flammable limit. Make sure it's safe. Start it up. And so that's what we're proposing to do with a sample size beginning with about 3,500 barrels. And I know there are a lot of concerns about at what level it might become safe or not safe for employees or others in the building the last time we were here that expressed as we're ramping up to do the testing itself. So I think it might be helpful actually if Chris could explain to you the actual process of getting barrels into this warehouse, because that in and of itself is it's not an overnight thing. It is a slow, gradual process, which will enable us to show you that it's safe. So Chris, why don't you talk about exactly what happens when barrels come from storage?
Okay, so I think it's safe to say that we all understand that a whiskey barrel, which typically weighs around 500 pounds, is physically challenging to move. The Michigan state road laws will only allow approximately 90 barrels at a time to be on one truck. We can fit up to 100, but they actually cap it at 90 because of weight. So this is a weight issue. Now, when loading barrel storage racks, there's a human component to it. There's somebody operating a barrel lift. Typically the racks, and actually the racks in this very specific example, are 3 high per level. There are 4 levels in the rick house, including a barrel elevator. So every barrel, which weighs 500 pounds, needs to be moved off of a truck. It needs to be laid down horizontally and rolled to a specific rack location, lifted with a specialized barrel elevator and rolled onto a rack and put in position. Rinse and repeat that same process per barrel 90 times in one day. You're a very tired human. This process is very slow. It takes time and it takes a lot of man hours. And just as an example, we refer to them just as barrel trucks. When a barrel truck comes in, it usually takes a full probably 4 hours with a team of 6 people to unload it and tag each barrel and move the barrels into the correct rack location. The point is, the process of loading this warehouse will not happen overnight. It cannot happen overnight because of the human condition. There's no way to move that amount of weight effectively and safely fast. So it's slow. The point is, every barrel truck that comes in will have a maximum of 90 barrels. And even a barrel truck on back-to-back days is a very, very strenuous exercise. So this whole process has to be spread out over time because it's just not physical. It's physically, it's too exhausting to try to cram too much movement into back-to-back days or even 2 trucks in the same day. Is it possible? Yes. Is it sustainable? Absolutely not. So my point is, once a truck comes in, a second truck in that day is doable, but unlikely. So as we load this rick house, and currently all of our barrels, most of our barrels are stored out of state. We're trying to bring that to Michigan. It's part of the process. The barrels will travel from Indiana up to Traverse City and be unloaded 1 truck at a time over the course of weeks, months. And Scott has laid out the math for that, but that is generally the process that we're looking at. And I just want the board to be aware that this is a challenge.
And not just a challenge, but a slow process that enables lots of opportunity to make sure that it's a safe process. Because as you just heard from Chris, to get up to this initial sample size of 3,500 or so, you can't do that in 30 days. Even 60 days would be a challenge. So Scott, if you want to now talk about the plan that's been developed. And by the way, this individual who was not here with us the last time, do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Guy Russo. I am the Senior Project Manager for Michigan Consulting and Environmental's Traverse City office. I'm a licensed professional engineer with 29 years of experience in civil and environmental engineering.
And he is going to speak about the testing process itself, measuring the vapor levels. But go ahead, Scott.
And Scott, remember the microphone's right here.
Okay. So in part of the most recent packet that we gave you, there is a 1-sheet spreadsheet that is the schedule. So if you could refer to that, it has, thank you. Yeah, I don't have it. It has months and they're numbered on the left side with the month. And what that is based on is what Chris described earlier to you, his maximum ability to receive barrels per week and per month and install them. You also notice that there's an add of barrels and a subtract of barrels. That's because during the 4 months that it will take us to get to to fill the testing area, they'll be harvesting some of the whiskey. So the net is around, I think it says 840 a month. And that gets to, that is 4 months worth of, I believe that is a 3 to 4 year program that's outlined there before the warehouse will actually be completely full to capacity.
Okay, and you want to talk about the testing?
Certainly.
I've got a quick question. The process of moving the barrels, is there specific provisions within OSHA or anything that need to be followed that for weight, like moving the barrel around? Or
There are, I can't tell you what they
well,
are.
then I'm just curious if there's like industry specific safety protocol.
I think Chris and I can speak a little bit to the industry specific safety protocols or how it's done. So the barrels I think they'll use a forklift to get them off the truck onto what's essentially a large dumbwaiter that takes them from one level to the other. The design of the barrel, it's partly for structure, but it allows them to, with little effort, be tipped over onto their side, and they'll rock back and forth a little bit. The barrel needs to be in its horizontal position in order to roll down tracks that are installed in the aisles. And so that process is done. The people stay behind it, and there's a spotter and so on and so forth. And it gets to this thing that they call a ricker, or which Chris referred to as a barrel elevator. And that is specifically designed to raise it in third increments to the exact height of the racks. And so the barrel then, the rack is here, the barrel is sitting here, getting ready to roll, it raises up, and then it rolls on to essentially what looks like 2 4x4s. And they do a thing called clocking the barrel, so that when it rolls down this row in the rack, it will stop with the cork up.
Okay, thank you, yeah, I'm interested in also, I think it's, for me, hearing all those steps, you can see why it takes so long.
Yeah.
And obviously, the schedule is durations and dates.
Yes, and if I think, yeah, so I put numbers on the left, month 1, month 2, and then I put the actual month, and we're proposing, if we're successful in getting approval to do this, I think that the first month is September.
If you start in September 23, by this will be done in November of 26, fully loaded.
Correct. And then,
Understand that there'd be some reduction in inventory as the market.
Yes, yep, there's gonna be some coming and going
Yeah.
of barrels.
A better way to put it.
Yep.
I have a question. Is the process of putting the barrels in for this testing any different than putting the barrels, when you're gonna put barrels in there? So I mean, when you do it for the test, I mean, that's the way you do it.
Absolutely, to create the most real world scenario possible.
Right, so doing it for testing isn't any different than you're gonna put the barrels in.
Correct.
Okay,
well,
thank you.
well, there's actually a slight difference. So
Mm.
normally the ricks are loaded one corner, 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 corner. So that that facilitates sort of first in, first out, and it helps them with harvesting the most recent one or the oldest ones and so forth. But what we're going to do is just take one section, about a quarter of the building down the middle, and rather than
When you
loading.
say I'm sorry, when you say corner, so I understand, corner of the building.
Quarter.
Oh, you look, normally they load them corner to corner of the building, but we're going to take about a quarter of the building.
Okay, but you were talking, when you said corner, we're talking corner of the building, not a corner of a bay or something.
Correct. The normal process would be to load the lower ones all evenly and bring them up all together. But what we're going to do so that we can use a smaller amount of barrels, so what we're proposing to simulate is take about a quarter of that section and bring that up like this. That way we're testing with about 3,500 barrels, and we're applying, because the alcohol vapor is heavier than air, we're going to apply the lower 6 or 7 feet of visqueen there to effectively make a smaller building.
I have a question about the visqueen, and it's probably inappropriate this time, but I'm gonna ask it anyways. I think visqueen is kind of my suggestion. I
It's a good one.
agree with the idea of it, but I'm a little concerned about the accuracy of any measurement, that if I stack stuff from this tabletop to here, and I visqueen from here down, the vapors from the upper barrels, they don't know that they're expected to fall straight down. So they're gonna go off to every corner of the building as the ventilation is causing them to move. So I actually would think if we move forward with the idea of this test section, this clean should go all the way up. So it can take it, it basically simulates a building.
That's what I thought too. And then in discussion with Guy, we started thinking about, well, what is this building like? And this building is kind of open to the air. And so if we went all the way up, then we would not allow the horizontal, air to flow into our test area.
We only have it on two sides.
Right, rather than in the real barrel warehouse has it all around.
And that's, I think, a conundrum that has to be addressed because the 7-foot vapor is moving all around, so you're not getting an accurate measurement within the bay that you're going to be measuring.
I'll let Guy speak to the accuracy of the measurement, but I would also point out that, based on the very slow adding, I mean, we haven't, we would expect that there would be some sort of ongoing confirmation, as we continue to.
Do you lower and I have no experience in the whiskey business, okay, other than as a consumer. Do you lower the full level and then lower the next level?
Yes. Start at the bottom and work your way up.
The full level, not.
Yep.
I mean, that seemed like the right way to lower the rick, but I don't know.
Yep, you're correct.
Guy, sorry, you were gonna introduce yourself. Go ahead.
Oh, I thought I did already.
Yeah,
Oh,
No, but
you were gonna
talk
get
about your
started, I guess,
testing.
then. You're gonna start.
tell them what you do.
Yeah, well, basically, I guess I'm there here as an environmental consultant, and I've been asked by Traverse City Whiskey to evaluate the possibility of a flammable or explosive environment. And that's exactly what we're proposing to do. I'd like to do it in 2 phases. In this particular case, we're interested in ethanol. All right, and ethanol is a volatile organic compound. It does occur somewhat naturally. The first part that I'm proposing in this testing is I'd like to do evaluate the background atmosphere within the warehouse building. And my concern there is I don't want to wait 6 months or however long it's going to take to fill these warehouses and have the lab come back and say, oh, there's a formaldehyde in the air or an alkene in the air. And therefore we had to guess at what the ethanol concentrations were. So I want to establish a background so that the lab and everybody knows what things were like before the ethanol was introduced to the atmosphere, and to verify that we are getting accurate measurements of the ethanol. After we're going to do that before they load the warehouse. I propose we put 3 SUMA canisters, which is a pressurized stainless steel vessel, a vacuum under vacuum reverse pressure, that will suck air into the canister over a set period of time. We have absolute control over that set period of time. It could be anywhere from 2 hours to 2 days. We're going to propose to do this over an 8-hour period during daylight hours when the temperatures are the warmest. That's when the most volatilization from the barrels should occur. After we get our background, we're going to fill the warehouse. We're going to propose to sample in 6 different locations at floor level, because ethanol is heavier than air. So we're going to sample 6 different locations within that cordoned off area of the warehouse and determine if the ethanol concentrations approach 25% of the lower flammability liquid limit, which is 0.825%, or 8,250 part per million, or 8,250,000 part per billion. The methodology I am proposing will measure ethanol to 6 parts per billion. So if it's there, we will know it's there, and we will know what the concentrations are.
And that's all the equipment that's noted within this, the documents, right?
The SUMA canister, when we go in to set the canisters, we will be screening the oxygen with a handheld photoionic detector, which will give us a lower flammability reading in the part per million range, just to make sure that everything is safe and that the people working there are not going to be exposed to anything unacceptable.
Does the board have any questions?
I'm a little concerned that you'll do the testing under 1/4 of the capacity of the building. But I'm I would still vote for the test.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, we'll hold questions till the staff. If, is there anything else that the applicant would like to add? Present your request.
No,
All right, thank you. So I can invite the building safety department to present your ruling on this particular piece of the sub of the day.
I'm gonna have you start with your overall
Okay,
feels.
well, I guess what I'd like to start with is the codes are a preventative. They like to, if there's a problem, have a situation in place to or rectify the situation ahead of time. So those provisions are supposed to be in place. So like a restaurant that's doing a kitchen has to put a type 1 hood in before they can be operational. It's not trying to see if they ever are going to burn a hamburger to know if it ever works or not. That system has to be in place before they can get occupancy. So that's the way the codes work. It's just, stuff has to be in place. For that reason, doing a sample test and testing and all of that is a situation that doesn't really fit into the code. If there's a problem, he's just testified how long it takes to get the barrels in. If there's a problem, how long is it going to take to remedify it or rectify the situation? How they can't get the quantity of barrels out of there. There's no ventilation in place to get the hazardous situation contained. There is a standard in NFPA 30 that sets a different rate for the situation of getting out of the strenuous 1 CFM per square foot. It talks about it, and it's all about square footage of a building, not quantity. It takes into quantity too. But it's a complex equation to get there. It's over our heads. So last week we kind of reached out. In the end of the packet, you could probably see where we got a hold of a mechanical contractor in Traverse City. It's over our heads. We're not whiskey experts. So we kind of tried to present out a scenario where the equation that Delkita's, we don't know our assumption is the equation that they used is equation to declassify the building to get rid of the explosion proof. So we reached out to a mechanical engineer to verify whether this equation fits into the NFPA 30 standard. It gives a specific way to determine what rate should be applied to this building. We didn't get that back. We got a response back, but I don't think it was relayed. The question we were actually asking was relayed correctly to the mechanical contractor or engineer. So there is a standard for an alternate rate. That's what the county would be looking for an alternative. What's that?
Can you tell us that?
I can give you the book. It's complicated.
I'm already saturated.
There's 2 pages here that'll make your head spin. And it's complicated enough that I can't even tell if this formula was the one Delkita used.
Can you tell us whether they use this methodology?
Yeah, you mind if I come up and look at? Showing
Oh, yeah.
They're looking at it, suspect.
Is this the, oh, it's the Annex F.
Annex F and NFPA 30.
No, I didn't. This is based on, for hydrocarbon. So. Should only applies to hydrocarbons.
Scott, if you go to that other sticky note I've got in there,
Yeah.
that talks about the whiskey.
Does it, so it doesn't.
It sends you to Annex F for, but if you read the commentary, it tells you that the 1 CFM is not a good standard to go by. And that's the only place that I could find that would actually give you an equation to, for an alternative design.
I can tell you that we didn't use this equation. We didn't use this as the source. Our equations were developed by a chemical engineer that had graduated from the School of Mines, which is one of the top oil and gas mining schools in the country. He was an employee at Alkita, and he developed the equations based on research that he did. I'm just curious, I probably don't need to take the time more right now and just find out if these look to be similar.
The biggest discrepancy I found is there's safety factors installed in that one. And then there's also, they're saying you're supposed to take the cubic feet of the building, but they're saying it's not, because of gas, it's not appropriate to take a tall ceiling
That's right,
thing. But their recommendation is to do the bottom 10 foot.
Yeah,
You guys did 2 foot. So I'm curious to where your equation and this equation differs.
yeah, I'd have to read that carefully and run the numbers on it. But yeah, like you say, our equation takes the bottom 2 feet. And we call it the volume of interest. And so it's basically 2 times the square footage. And that's so rather than, that's an important thing is cubic, CFM, cubic feet per minute is a volume. And then we have to convert it to a small.
Can you restate that only because I'm concerned anybody listening might not hear what was, or Scott, do you want to in the microphone?
Oh.
Sorry to do that.
So we use the bottom 2 feet rather than, rather than the bottom 10 feet. And this is not our calculation. The calculation that we did was developed by a chemical engineer. So if you're looking to replicate it, probably another chemical engineer would be the one to do it. But it's important to note that cubic feet per minute is what we're talking about, which is a volumetric measurement. As you say, we have to reduce that volume to where the alcohol settles to within the lower 2 feet. So this is probably a little bit more general because it does talk about hydrocarbons and so forth in here. But yeah, I'd be curious to know how it comes out. But I can tell you that we've used these calculations for about 8 years now on over 100 places, and not only for warehouses, but my partner Matt and I have also gone through those calculations with a fine-tooth comb, and we're certain that they're accurate, and so hopefully we'll get an opportunity to prove it specifically to this building.
So our concerns are that standard there is in NFPA 30, that equation. This one is an equation that we're not familiar with. So as far as ventilation rates go, I think I would be concerned about the difference between the two. I'd like to see where that comes out. We can't do it. We're going to have to send it off to somebody qualified to do it. And then now that we've made that first determination, our other concerns would be, you know, the general things required in the code that exhaust ventilation shall be designed to consider the density of the potential fumes of vapors for fumes or vapors that are heavier than air. Exhausts that are taken from a point within 12 inches of the floor for times of vapors that are lighter than air. Exhaust shall be taken from a point within 12 inches of the highest point of the room. Our concerns are, without reading these out loud to you, we want to ensure that a rate can be witnessed to get rid of a hazard. So we kind of threw around maybe a smoke test. We do that for ventilation of hoods and stuff. If you put a smoke candle in the corner of a room, is that going to exhaust out with the system that is designed? That's our concern, a practical way of visually seeing that it will work in all areas of the building. Our other concern is the way this building is built with natural ventilation and mechanical ventilation. If you combine the two, how do you keep it from short cycling? If they got windows open and your exhaust is down here, what's going to keep that air from coming in the natural and out the exhaust and not able to get the fumes out in a different area of the building? So combining natural ventilation and mechanical ventilation is a problem in our eyes. So those are the problems I see with what they have proposed so far.
Recommendation.
I would like to see where that equation lays out and propose that that's probably a starting point, and then maybe test it with a smoke test to see if it works before they put anything in the building.
The problem with moving barrels in is you need occupancy of some sort. And all life safety issues have to be resolved for us to issue a temporary or a full occupancy of the building. In the letter I enclosed to you guys, there's a couple elements listed that we'd have to, you know, be taken into consideration here. One is that the fire suppression and alarm system be in place and fully operational, and backup power also needs to be in place and operational. Those are just two elements, not to mention what happens here.
A question about the candle test though, isn't candle smoke warm and will go up, will head up rather than act like vapor?
That's why we never proposed that solution, but I don't know how else to.
And a question to the calculation that was in the packet that Amber sent to the SIDOC group. Was the calculation that they did matching what's in this book here? Or
No.
did they give their own interpretation and calculation?
They only received Delkita's stuff from what I understand, they took Delkita's test and did the math on their test.
Okay.
Is the way I understood it.
So they checked the math.
They checked the math.
They didn't affect it, they checked the methodology.
Correct.
What they say is, we received the code pages from the drawings that you sent us and agree with the logic and comments that were made in the documents. We could not completely follow their calculations, so we did our own calculations, see attached, and came up with a similar ventilation rate. Our recommendations would be to those that were mentioned in the calculation sheets you sent me. One, install a warning system linked to the fire alarm to a signal a fan's failure, to signal a fan's failure. Install permanent ethanol detectors. These would be used to determine the LFL exceeds, if the LFL exceeds 25%, and then alarm to fire panel or some other enunciation panel that is monitored. So. Is there any question? Do you guys have any further explanations or comments? You being the building safety department? Those are not in the room.
I would have to say NFPA 30 sends you to Annex F for exhaust rates. If we complied with Annex F for exhaust rates, I think we would meet without doing a test. I would have concerns about the combination of natural and mechanical ventilation.
And again, this in effect, I'm sorry, I'm not. What is this one called in the 3-ring binder?
This is NFPA 30.
And that is referenced.
Annex F is located in it.
Okay, and that is then referencing to the mechanical code, or that's referenced by?
This is a
mechanical?
standard. It's flammable and combustible liquids.
Testing standard.
The testing standard? What's the question?
He's
That's
asking,
testing
is this a
The
testing
testing
standard?
standard.
Yes.
You get from ASTM or something like that.
It's a testing standard in NFPA 30, yep.
And it's.
Industry standard that sends you there for storage of
Those are-
flammable and combustible liquids.
Okay. And there's no standard like that in the industry for testing for whiskey?
Well, whiskey is a flammable liquid, so
I understand, but sometimes there's specific standards.
they write them vague so they fit multiple different.
Okay. I've written standards myself for ASTM for my industry before, and it takes years and over a decade to get a paragraph approved by everyone, so I understand, but I'm just wondering, I was just curious if there is a standard that was specific, but I guess that's.
This is the only one I could find, and I found this one off from Delkita's listing of standards. They have NFPA 30 on here. If they can come up with another equation that's recognized, we would be open to interpretation on that.
So their testing method or their calculation references that standard.
Takes you to NFPA 30, yep. 17.11.
Do you know if SIDOC also utilized or referenced that, or?
It doesn't appear that way. When I had initial dialogue with him, I did express to him what our path was, so he was going to be looking at it, but I didn't get any information back from him, and I got this back late Friday, so I didn't have a chance to follow up with a conversation either.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't have any other questions. Anybody on this side of the microphone have anything else to say or question? Looks like we're good. For discussion.
Do you guys want to do question and answer with them? Before- yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, that would be good.
Skip that one. Question and answer.
Oh, sorry.
Here.
Doesn't make any difference to me. I forgot that there was some furniture changing.
At the point of bringing in the sample barrels, and it sounds like the duration of bringing them in would be a few weeks. Week.
To bring the barrels in for the sample test.
4 months.
4 months for the first for the ones, to get the first sample area, the sample area full. Would everything in the building, by way of life safety, be in place?
Yes,
Ready? So the sprinkler system would be operational, backup power would be operational.
yes, we were about a week away from completing everything and received a stop work notice on the building. So we stopped work, but in order to complete that work, we're looking at about a week, 2 tops, to have everything functional and ready.
And there's still the question of whether of the electrical devices and their explosion issue, or is it present or not? And I guess that question is.
So, yeah, you asking someone over there or you asking
Amber,
me?
where are we on the electrical devices?
Mr. Schwab, can you answer that?
What the code calls for is a fail-safe operation. And what that means is that if they can demonstrate that they can, with mechanical ventilation at an acceptable rate to keep the LDL below 25, that they can have non-explosive food, but it has to have backup power, has to have the ventilation, it has to have monitoring so that nothing can happen. That's the fail-safe operation.
Okay, so, and that's with mechanical ventilation.
That's with mechanical ventilation.
So if we have a passive ventilation or I'm using the wrong term, what?
Using natural ventilation,
Natural ventilation,
then certain requirements come in for exposure.
and will we have that?
But we've not gone with the mechanical, the natural ventilation is a louver system through the whole thing.
Mhm.
That's what would be required to meet a full natural ventilation.
And we don't have that.
No,
So the gentleman,
We're talking about what would be a hybrid natural ventilation. Or we're, I guess, within the categories. Mechanical ventilation, natural ventilation, where do we see ourselves?
so for this verification section, if you'll turn in your packet to a sheet that has, I'm not sure exactly what page it is, it has the Dalkita logo on the upper right-hand corner. It's a 2-page document, which is a fresh, it's a
Page 36.
Yeah.
So it's a fresh calculation that I did based on this this verification area that we're looking at, which calculates both the infiltration rate. Infiltration is not what is referred to as natural ventilation in the code, and it's not mechanical ventilation. It's the amount of air that comes in through a building that is not abnormally tight. This is a uninsulated, unconditioned metal building. So it's very, very loose. So we've calculated what we expect the ventilation rate to be in there and then compared that amount of air to the amount needed to maintain concentrations under 25% of the LFL. So we do have in place the necessary foolproof, because you can't stop the air from coming in, doesn't require electricity. We have that in place during our sampling period. And I also, yeah, so that's what we've got there.
And then we're expecting the air to come in from the bottom of the panels, around the perimeter of the building,
And the top, yeah.
and the top.
Yeah, actually, we're probably more expecting it to go out the bottom a little bit. The alcohol vapor, as it settles down, is going to try to level out, and it'll probably go up. Expecting it to.
But it's unheated air.
That's correct.
And we do get a little bit of snow around this area. So the bottom of the building is going to be snowpacked or snow packed.
Not during our,
Our area of time of concern is concerned.
yeah,
Temperatures. are.
yeah. So
But in the winter time, there will be no ventilation in the building.
that's why we are proposing in our application to actually add mechanical ventilation is.
And my concern, not trying to throw another cog in the system, but if we forget about the angel share, which when the weather, when it's cooler, that level goes down.
Correct.
If we have a leaky barrel, and I know you'll be monitoring that if it relates to business loss too. But if we do have a leaky barrel, that vapor will occur. And that can occur in the winter.
Yeah, yes, yeah, and actually it's typical for, I don't know, there's probably some percentage, but when the barrels leak, it's a very small amount. And the amount of evaporation that would come from, even if they all leaked a drop a day, would be negligible. It wouldn't, we've done calculations for evaporation from puddles, for instance. And, the entire surface of a roof, and that is a relatively low rate of evaporation, particularly in colder weather. So it's, in my expert opinion, the fact that a few barrels may leak before they are able to plug them with the little tar that they used is a negligible concern.
Do you guys, do you see the suggestions from SIDOC? Does that meet, in your opinion, what you have proposed, or is there anything that is majorly different from what they recommend?
We have not seen that and would very much like to, as was pointed out earlier. When Ethan handed out.
Sorry, was this part of the submittal that
It was in the package.
the PDF
Yeah.
on Thursday,
Yes.
right? Yeah, we
Have we received?
We have, it came in on Thursday at some point, and it was a combination of our submittal and the county submittal.
For our review.
And did that include, I heard someone saying, reading something
Yeah,
about.
it was an email chain that you
Yeah,
were
it's an
dictating.
email from SIDOC what happened is, it looks like, I guess, Amber, correct me if I'm wrong, it went one engineer who suggested was beyond their capabilities, and you went to SIDOC, correct?
Yeah.
And then you got a response back and they gave their recommendation based on their own calculation.
Yeah, late last week, we made this discovery and in an effort to get more information, we went out to a couple guys and we got information like Friday, so it was all included in the packet. It was sent to you guys. I do have one printout copy here if you guys want to look at it for reference.
I haven't seen it yet.
So his recommendation, again, is to install a warning system linked to the fire alarm to signal fan failure. Number one. Number two is install permanent ethanol detectors. These would be used to determine if the LFL exceeds 25%, and then alarm the fire panel or some type of enunciation panel. So it's just, that is in an effort of finding a resolution here, that's why I'm pointing this out. This is what was recommended to the county.
The fail-safe is based on having a mechanical ventilation, is what we've been looking at, what I've been looking at. Otherwise, there's no way to make sure that the fumes are out of the building unless there's a complete flow of air down below. If there's a wind and the wind bills are high, it's not going to move the gas out of the building. But if there's a mechanical ventilation there and they have all the correct things to make for the warning stuff, that is a fail-safe operation that I could. Okay.
So you're saying that if it was a system that an alarm was set off,
Yeah.
and then it opens, the mechanical opens. I guess I'm curious, and and these recommendations, I know you're just seeing now. But is there, what similarities is there here between testing that you're proposing? Is there an alarm, or is it a mechanic who come to the site and monitor your pressure tanks or vacuum? Is that connected to something that an alarm, if it hits or exceeds the 25 FL or LFL? Or how is that?
To my knowledge, I don't know if that's incorporated into the design, but I'm sure it could be. There are detectors out there and equipment that could measure that.
So the testing that we're proposing
Mhm.
is not something that is permanently installed. It's something to see how much alcohol vapor is there. So it's a real world confirmation of the calculations that have been done by Dalkita and now also by the SIDOC group, which say that around 1200 CFM is all that's necessary.
Just wired.
I think you're asking me the question, are we currently proposing to install a warning linked to fan failure and ethanol detectors that are linked to the fire alarm panel? So in our efforts to confirm that the calculations are accurate and the ventilation rate stated or proposed is acceptable, we're not proposing to have a warning system during that time or permanent ethanol detectors, because part of the purpose of doing the experiment is to find out if they're really needed. And I should note that these two items that are recommended, these are requirements for an H3 occupancy with flammable liquid vapor, other than where barrels are concerned. So the exception that had been discussed earlier, exception 10 to chapter 50, and exception non-applicability item number 10 to chapter 57 in the fire code. Whereas those chapters would require this for the distillation, for instance. It doesn't require for barrels. But I think in earlier conversations with the county, we did discuss that the eventual final build out would include mechanical exhaust designed to draw the exhaust from within 12 inches of the floor, ducted up to 4 or 5 feet above the finished floor, so that it will, so we don't plug the infiltrating air at the bottom when it snows. That would be that's what our current proposed design that is under review by the county or had been rejected by the county is to do, is to provide that. The rate of ventilation that SIDOC says we need, actually, we're proposing a little bit more for the entire building at a mechanical. And it would not be onerous to the owner to provide a signal on fan failure. We do that for areas of distilleries other than barrel warehouse all the time. And it would also not be onerous to install a number of LFL detectors. I don't think we could install 100% full coverage practically, but I would have to rely on someone like Guy, who knows more about the various kinds of testing equipment that's available, to help me understand that.
Thank you. Many other questions for either group? The question is, if they're testing, I think that correct me if I'm wrong, Amber, in that, but the main question is if their proposed testing is adequate. Is that the main question?
Ethan, what would you say here? What are we asking them for here?
Well, I think what we've asked for is for the board to approve the applicant's alternative proposal for a variance or approval of an equal or better form of construction based upon the phase startup plan and testing proposed.
Does that clarify for you guys?
Yes,
Okay.
for me.
Did you capture that?
You know, basically, the method of storing and testing within the building, is that right?
No. So we're asking for a vote from the board to approve the applicant's proposal of an equal or better form of construction, which is represented by the phase startup plan and testing procedure proposed by the applicant.
I think one of the hurdles we have here is before you can move barrels in there, you have to have temporary occupancy. Before temporary occupancy is issued, you have to meet certain life safety issues, which are what your temporary occupancy would be proving that you can do. So we got this circle again.
And I can address that. And I think the way that the applicant has proposed this to the board in our latest submission is that a certificate of occupancy will be issued with restrictive covenants on the applicant, which incorporate the phase startup plan, the testing procedure, and the requirements that the building be maintained at safe LFL levels, which if are not met, then the occupancy will be revoked.
The difficulty we have in giving occupancy or temp occupancy is we have to take into consideration the building as a whole. Even though they're only going to use this small area for the sample, we still have to consider the entire building when making that determination. That's our conflict.
I think, okay, I'm gonna just propose something and I'd like to hear both sides of this discussion address it. It seems to me, if you want to put together, I mean, you've done an admirable job of drawing up what you're proposing to do in terms of the temporary area. But an outline that defines during this temporary occupancy, what you're going to have completed and done, what the building is going to consist of relative to life safety. And so that you put together what you think you're going to, what you're proposing to do, so the building department can then respond that, yes, that's fine, or it's fine, but we need 1, 2, 3 extra things. So that we can get to this point. This board can't grant you a temporary occupancy.
And
Well, let me put it another way. I'm not gonna vote on a temporary occupancy. He's gonna abstain and nothing will pass.
right, and that's why I don't think we phrased it quite
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about amounts to a temporary occupancy, a limited occupancy.
Well, no, it's a permanent occupancy subject to revocation if we don't do what we say we're going
But
to do.
a limited occupancy, and for that limited occupancy, the building department has to issue a temporary occupancy permit.
Yeah, there isn't a limited. It would be either full or temporary. Temporaries are given if you don't have everything done. Say, for example, you're building a new house and your basement's not finished.
I get it.
That's what.
Well, and that's why I said it's, our request was for a certificate of occupancy with conditions built into the certificate. Restrictive covenants essentially, that the applicant says the this occupancy is based on compliance with A, B, C, D, E. And as long as those are complied with, no problem. If they're not, if the building inspector finds they are not complied with, occupancy is revoked.
So once we give occupancy, we're done too. We don't come back out there. That's like our bow on the gift. It's done. So we give you occupancy for the sample area. but
Until
it's for
there's
the-
new construction.
Yes.
Yeah.
It closes everything out. Even with your restrictive covenants, we would be done.
Yeah, until there was a complaint or a problem.
I've got a question for building safety. What would you need for, to be able to issue them occupancy with or without any covenants, special conditions or conditions?
I think we need a plan that we feel meets an alternative design approved before we can go anywhere. We're not approving the design, alternative design that is proposed at this point. We need to come up with an alternative design before we can go anywhere. Now we have a ruling on that first part, we can move forward with an alternative design.
Scott, I wanted to ask you, our proposal here. So in the end, we're gonna end up with we are gonna end up with a mechanical system, and your proposal is the 0.06, right? I mean, in the very end, we're gonna have a mechanical system in place. And it'll, at the 0.06 is what you're proposing to do, so. My only issue with everything is, and I think the test idea is great. But even in our test area, if there's a problem, we don't have a system in place for the evacuation of the vapors. Yes.
So sorry, just
Go ahead.
one piece of that is, but if we got to a 25% LFL moment, because we have this test environment bound by visqueen,
Okay,
take the visqueen down, all of a sudden you're safely spreading out the issue. That is the merit behind this exercise. And that is why creating a very sound environment, a very controlled environment. The safety piece is we don't even have to provide access to it. Maybe on the backside to take it down, but at the end of the day, we know that because the ethanol vapors are heavier than air.
and your guy, I mean, you would be fine with that as far as diluting the vapors?
Yes.
That, you know,
We talked about a quarter of the building.
and I just don't want to get lost in the fact that we're gonna end up with mechanical ventilation here. That's not off the table, because we're gonna have.
That's what's in the current
Yeah.
submittal that the county rejected, and if this is allowed to proceed, then that will
Prove
be-
that would work.
Yeah, then that will prove that will work. You know, we have a third party that you guys hired that basically confirmed the calculations that 0.06 CFM will work with us. So I think that also gives us a measure of safety or assurance.
I just wanted to get that out there, that we're not trying to do this building without the mechanical. In the end, we're gonna have that air movement.
Yeah, in the end, we're gonna have the mechanical ventilation there.
I mean, because the concerns from the board too are the snow in the wintertime, and we don't have the,
And that's a very valid concern, because as I said before, we think the vapor is going to settle down and dissipate horizontally. And so that was something that the county brought up. That was a very good thing that has come from the discussions, the looking critically at what's going to happen with infiltration when the snow goes up. So that's why we have gone to the mechanical. And although the code doesn't require it, there's, as I said, there's nothing, it's easy to interlock a fan with a fan motor with a fire alarm that's easy to.
Yeah, tie it in.
Yeah.
I mean, as the owner, I would think Chris would want, you want to know when there's a problem with your building.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, we generally don't do that. I've done enough of these that I'm so confident that those alarms will never go off. But having it there is sort of a belt and suspenders, as long as it doesn't present a hardship to the owner, is perfectly fine.
We've been going for almost 2 hours and 15 minutes. We'll take a 8-minute break, 10-minute break, I guess. Let's come back at, what is that? I guess 11:25. It's easier math, easier math. 11:25.
So if we do that, do we even do that? Can we reach an agreement among us?
well, and in the sense of the test area, yeah, we're testing it. And if it gets high, we can move barrels out, rip the plastic down. You know, I'm electric.
For me, on the electric trucks, that's a different situation.
Yeah.
It has to be fail safe on the core and that means the mechanical demolition. If you're eventually end up with a mechanical demolition, put it in. Then I can go with that for next stage.
Yeah.
How long does it, so Scott, what's the plan for mechanical ventilation?
So the plan is to have 0.06 CFM for mechanical ventilation, which we have it proposed two 600 CFM, two 600 CFM fan in the wall at one end of the building. And then
Upper louvers.
Are they in already?
No.
no, they're not in already. And we would love to put them in, and that's part of what Chris is saying.
When I say what's the plan, I mean, what's the plan to get them in there?
We need a blessing on the strategy before we do anything. So we're good to move forward, but we're not doing anything until we get a thumbs up.
So we can put that in
As long as there's a fail safe with an acceptable ventilation rate. I don't accept the ventilation rate. I just say it's gotta be there. And it's gotta have it's gotta have backup power. And it's gotta have.
So Chris, how long will it take to get those fans in?
You better use your own, ready to go.
Yeah, it's pretty quick. It just if we have an approval on that mechanical ventilation in writing from the county as a blessing to move forward, then we'll do it.
I would have to do
That's,
before.
what are your thoughts on it?
Even
You
a
guys just
test.
run him through the proposal real quick since he
I'm
accepted.
going on my own, but I'm going back.
All right,
For the testing, see.
There's no more testing.
Wrong with my back.
yeah, he doesn't want to hear about testing.
And we can't also,
He just- he-
in other words, you said you go in and shut the power off. That doesn't work for me
I will
either.
just question it.
We'll hold on, let's.
Let's go back to the
address one at a time. So
With 5 days in the outback.
to satisfy electrical, mechanical ventilation has to be in before anything else goes into the building.
Yeah.
The rate is acceptable with the mechanical ventilation you've already proposed.
I'd like to see where that NXF comes out. I don't think that 0.06 is acceptable.
So stressful.
So
Okay, you just told us you thought.
side at group that the county hired does.
We can reach back out to them, find out where the NXF is. And then we the question proposed to them was not answered like we asked.
We got one part of our.
We don't know where that equation comes from. If you can find another equation that comes up somewhere,
It's like.
annex up, I found through your stuff.
So.
Yeah,
Beginning of the annex.
I gotta shake.
Not part of it. We've got calculations from. And from your own,
And from your own end, I don't know the side act group, but I'm interested in looking them up.
We don't either.
So,
We don't know who they are.
yeah, I mean, Amber.
They have no dog in the fight.
Right, they're good third party.
Yeah,
So-
Amber, I think at some point, you're gonna need to make this decision.
The reason 0.06 I have a problem with is the two that I stated. How do you verify that you're getting air movement across the whole thing? And how do you combine them with natural and mechanical methods?
Excuse me, I'm gonna use the restroom.
0.06 is such a slow amount of air in a 20,000 square foot building. How does that just not disappear? Especially with all the bricking system that's involved in there. And barrel storage is blocking all the air.
And how did that get worded with what the board approved the first go round? If the board has already said the 0.06 is not acceptable, then we kind of have to get away from that now.
Well, but there's some,
There is, but if they've made a decision, now we have to follow that decision.
right, but
We need
it's
to read that
proposed
back.
as an alternate or better form of construction.
So you're saying,
You
regardless
have
of
to-
what they decided the first go round, we could still throw it in the mix under alternative.
Yeah, and as you pointed out earlier, there's that infallible language, so it's open to multiple interpretations. If the building official's interpretation changes, what the board, the board doesn't even need to. Okay, 'cause there's nothing before the board.
If we were to approve 0.06 right now, then what was the point of even appealing it?
Well, but with
We're already
conditions,
saying.
But there's.
but it's not just 0.06, okay? You know, it's 0.06 with what SIDOC says.
That's what.
On top
Okay,
of
so let me run through this scenario. If you have a 0.06 ventilation rate and the alarms do go off,
So we have.
how do you solve it? How do you get rid of the
Every other state.
hazards?
And this.
If you're starting at 0.06 and you're monitoring and your alarms go off,
Well,
what happens?
we're gonna test before that. With a small sample size before that would no longer be a problem.
So we're saying,
It's not, we're gonna ferret that out before the whole warehouse is full.
so the current proposal then is to put things in at 0.06, do these things as recommended by SIDOC. Also do the testing, you'd be given a full CO contingent on the testing results.
I didn't think any of us were on board with the number.
They're reevaluating.
I didn't think any one of us were agreed with.
I'm just digging into it to get the particulars.
Yeah, we talked in the office, none of us were for constructing a small area doing a sample.
They're saying.
Well, it's
they-
not that small,
they
it's still
will-
3,500
Well,
barrels.
I understand,
they're saying they will-
Well, I could get you some brownie bites if you want one of those.
We're trying to get to electrical.
I would much like to get them out of my office.
Brown.
Everything.
Would have no snacks.
You have to have mechanical records in place. The operation.
You got some coffee over there.
Thing, stipulation.
Yeah, snacks.
I don't see.
Which
how
you
we're
could always
going.
invoke.
We don't.
Them on
But you
lunchtime.
can.
Order some lunch.
So we're gonna be sitting here when you've got 20,000 barrels in their house and revoking it.
No, that's not what I'm saying, you're not gonna need to do that, we're gonna,
But that's what I'm saying, if it comes down to that.
we're gonna figure that out along with the board there, 20,000 barrels.
We have no system in place if something happens.
You're about
That's the
all I do
problem.
once.
Well, that's where I was trying to go with this mechanical, that it would be in place. Something to start with. Not that we're gonna agree to it, but
If
it's
anyone
something to
needs some-
start with.
I can't really call it nourishment, but you want a snack.
A lot of redundancy.
No, I feel bad.
I had one too. I just-
John, what's your take on this?
If they have been acceptable, as far as I'm concerned, as far as ventilation.
Yes.
Ventilation, ventilation set, that's acceptable. And it's tied in with backup power, so it can't fail if the power goes out. And the alarming system works.
Everybody is agreeing to the same thing, but we're not agreeing what acceptable ventilation is.
Well,
Well, that's the whole idea of the test.
That's not me.
To show what that could be. On a big scale.
Yeah, guys, we understand the concern.
So make it temporary while we do the test.
Because in that scenario, if there's any issue, all we can do is remove the barrier between the two.
And then you've got 3/4 of the warehouse empty.
You can also open the doors and windows and, run way more than 0.6.
And turn the fan on.
Design work.
And at that point, then you gotta reevaluate, if it failed, then you reevaluate your airflow.
That's right, exactly.
And remember, our test is not anywhere near 25% of the LFL. We're calling it 10%.
Right. 10% of the.
That's our barrier. So we're not trying to get.
So
in
your
here.
proposal was a 50 CFM fan running in that area too,
Somebody mentioned the weight too, did you?
wasn't it?
No,
Your new formula added that, like a 50 CFM.
Oh,
Where-
that was the infiltration calculation.
That's just the air leakage in the building,
Yeah,
right?
we expect that the air leakage in the building alone, during this proving period, will remove the alcohol vapor sufficient to maintain.
So the testing area, how is the mechanical ventilation going to be installed in this testing?
It's not gonna be installed.
Well, the mechanical ventilation will be already. Okay, it'll be in the building, the fans will be in the building. The testing area, we're saying slowly. If the test is above 10% LFL, we're gonna drop the screen and then you can turn the fans on in the building.
So are you proposing the, how many seats now installed?
We're proposing 12.
1,200 installed, so you're proposing to do that right now in running continuous? And then doing a small section of area as a,
Well, I think we'll try to get.
is that what you're proposing?
Yeah, that's not what, it wasn't originally the proposal, what I believe that.
What do we mean, just so I understand?
Test.
What do we mean by running it continuous?
Well, that's what exhaust is. That's what we're talking about here.
So I think you just said that you can go ahead and install the 2 fans, right? Is that what you're proposing to do, that we do that before the testing or after?
That's what we're talking about. Okay, this is we're trying to work together here, so.
Is this, are you saying you're not?
Putting 2
proposing
fans
to
in
run-
doesn't sound like a huge deal.
No, it's
We
fine.
had not
Yeah.
originally proposed to put the fans in because we wanted.
Test fails, we put the fans.
We may need 1 more minute here.
We'll grant you a few more minutes, but we do need to move on.
So the original proposal was not to put the fans in until after the test proves that they're the right volume. Okay, if they, for instance, if we do the test and it fails, comes out over, then we would want to purchase bigger fans. But if we can come to an agreement to allow us to proceed with the testing, we absolutely can put in those fans, because another solution, if it fails, is that to put in more of the same size fans.
if that gets us to a point where the county will agree to let us proceed, we will install the fans. And we can interlock them to the fire, the fire alarm system that's there.
So we got a building right now without explosion. If the 1200 CFM for your calculation is to declassify explosion, that's right.
Yes.
So if you've got a test area with the fans in place and you did your monitoring and the test failed, you took the visqueen down and turned the fans on. Does that make sense?
Hold on, but keep in mind though, we're not talking about 25%. We're talking about 10%.
Understand
So
that.
there's no moment of combustibility in this test scenario. So we're avoiding it at we're completely avoiding.
More than 50%.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
And it's pretty reasonable.
So you're not installing any ventilation at all for the test. It's not gonna be in place.
That's not what we proposed not to do, but we're telling you now that we can install.
Art, is that something you're open to?
My thing is that as soon as you tell me they have enough ventilation, then I can move forward with taking in, allowing it not to be exploded. All I have to look at for is okay that it's got enough ventilation to make it so it can't reach 25%. That's what my standards are set in my book. If it can't reach that, if he's telling me there's bad ventilation, it can't, I'm good.
So if they put the mechanical in
Mechanical has to be in those, yeah.
and they're testing at no more than 10%, they got a more than 50% safety factor there. I feel pretty comfortable with that from the building standpoint, but that's.
You have any temporary this?
Yeah, that's the standard we use when we cut open gas tanks, is 10% of the LAL.
I'd be open to that. I would like you to see you put it in writing.
Nothing's gonna happen without being there.
Yeah, we need to see it and go through it again before we can approve it. I think we can table that. Like, we can put it on a round table when we get a full proposal.
No, they just got to tweak their
Yeah,
proposal.
there's one part that needs to be tweaked in our proposal, which is adding fans before the test.
Yeah.
So are you doing,
Well,
is it the monitoring by third party? Or do you guys want temporary monitor, permanent monitoring?
for the test, I'm fine with that third party.
Okay.
So we're talking about the test again.
Right.
I'm thinking now in the realm of occupancy. Are we talking, we're giving full occupancy?
No.
Or
No, it's
we're giving
temporary.
temporary based on these things that
Yes.
result from the test?
Right, and then after the test, you can grant us full occupancy once
Test is a-
everybody's dead.
That'll be a final plan.
Yeah.
Test is a 4-month deal, so we got a 4-month temporary occupancy.
Which can be extended, I went through the language again, that there's no specific deadline, so I can make this a 4-month.
I would base that on Guy's findings from this third party. If he thinks he needs more testing or there's some variables that show up.
And there will be a lot of air, I don't know how the air is gonna flow through that building, there's gonna be places where it concentrates, you know. There's a lot of
That was a big
temperature.
concern I had with all the ricking and the barrels installed. You get a hot spot,
Mhm.
and you got natural mechanical ventilation,
And that's
and
why I
you can turn
proposed
something on, but you're.
the high number of locations was to try to identify that, what's going on. The 6 samples in that area is excessive.
But I do think the area we're trying it in, and able to mitigate it quickly by. So this is where. Your canisters are in there all the time, just an 8-hour period of time.
Just an 8-hour period, and then they're sent to a laboratory for analysis.
Guys, sounds like you guys have had some productive conversation. Do you guys want to tell the board where you have figured out or planned here? But
I think that what we'd like to do is pull this issue from the board. It seems like we've had productive conversation and come to a resolution. We're gonna have the TC Whiskey team make a couple tweaks to their proposal for us, and then we should be able to move forward with their phasing in.
okay.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And we all thank the board for your time and assistance.
Sure, yeah. And so what is do we move past the decision?
I think no further action is required by the
Okay.
Board of Appeals, so we can, if that's, everyone is in agreement with that process.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
So we would move down to,
is there any public comment? Seeing no public comment, we'll move to board member comment.
To adjourn. Sounds like they got one in hand now. Congratulations.
Yes, thanks, guys, and good luck. We will adjourn the meeting.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
We're almost there.
so good seeing
Jumping on a plane again?
I actually, looked with an hour advisor.
Oh,
They
okay.
never gave me a story. Mine, I don't know. This one got all overlapped, like this much, but I was a young buck. and they said,
Colorado.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Ready to go. So thank you for.
Take care.
Yeah.
While they do the testing.
Grand Traverse Orthopedics.
I'm going in tomorrow for my
Yeah, because the
shoulder.
second one was just getting all the confusing.
Hi, Nate.
So I'll be off for a minute. I think we're fine with this deal as long as there's mechanical.
Feels good.
ventilation.
So does it need to be the whole building?
Oh, it needs to be, I should talk to Amber about that. I was thinking that she was gonna ask for it during review, so.
I can probably don't need anything, but
Yeah.
Coke does us a lot of school.
Area that you finish.
Nothing.
Right, there's only three.
We'll get there.
Okay.
on its way.
I'll do it.
If you don't mind, because she asked for it here.
Yeah, I didn't have to do it for the whole build-out. Is that fairly new? The new lazy, because they didn't make me do it.
One absent today.
You're putting in new windows now?
Yeah.
Are you changing the size of them?
Yeah, they don't have.
They don't have it.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. So just for that.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's
if you don't
fine.
mind.
Well, we can move forward.
It's just weird they never made me do it. That's
Right. Yeah, that's
The
just the
building's
way it
now,
is.
is it finished?
Yeah.
Well, it's a whole barn and
Yeah.
finished space inside of it.
You already did.
We're expanding the finished space by 330.
You guys built it initially.
Yes.
If you,
Yeah, we didn't have a general because I own it, so we built it ourselves and I'm general contracting, I work, I get licensed electrician, licensed plumber to do that license required work.
right,
The rest of it is in-house.
okay. I'll double check, but if you. We have it on hand.
That's fine.
Good job, by the way.
Thanks, take
Yeah,
care.
good job, Chairman.
I think we were
I
all,
stumbled right through it.
No, you did fine.
this was probably one of the most complicated issues. I know it's the most complicated one since I've been here, that I've had to deal with.
Yeah, there's a lot of,
So,
I'm glad that they had some dialogue. about it.
yes, that's
Very-
the best we could hope for, to be honest with
Very
you.
helpful.
yes, take care,
See you,
bye.
Nate.
Bye.